My story begins when I left my mom's house. I had gone over to visit because my father, her husband of 63 years, recently passed away, and Mom wasn't taking it too well. I knew she needed support from her loved ones, and I was more than willing to go visit and keep her company, but it was getting late. My mom lives in the suburbs. Tidy lawns, plenty of neighbors, paved roads, and even though it was near 11 p.m. when I left, the streets were extremely lit by the streetlights who always had your safety and ease of mind at heart. These lights only lit the road though, and glancing across the street, the houses were casting in an eerie shadow. Even a rather safe, charming little neighborhood can seem spooky and uninviting when casting in a shadow. I admit I was terribly chilled. Sliding into my car, I revved the engine and waved to my mother, who was standing in the doorway, wrapped comfortably in a warm shawl. She waved back, her old and fragile arms shaking. I saw her mouth, "Be careful," and I smiled, backing out of the driveway. I turned out of the neighborhood, deciding to take the back way, the shorter way home tonight. In hindsight, that might not have been a good idea. I live a significant ways away, out in the middle of the country in the old farmhouse I grew up in, which my father had left in my name when he and my mom had moved out into a smaller place, more easy to care for and affordable. He, my father, had always told me growing up, "Don't go out at night and always beware the devils." He was a strong believer in anything and everything paranormal, a very superstitious man, and I always had to resist the urge to laugh at his words, but I knew he meant well. Driving down the dark country roads, there were no streetlights, and the half-assed paved road was cracked and filled with potholes. The fields on either side of the road were empty, just blank stretches of overgrown grass and untended shrubbery. The dark outline of the trees of the woods could be seen looming all the way across the fields on the shadowy horizon. One might have even seen a deer or two once in a while in those fields, but not tonight. The moon offered little light as the sky rolled with dark, threatening clouds ready to burst with rain or a storm at any moment. Sure enough, a few moments later, the low grumble of thunder sounded, heavy and long. However, no rain fell just yet, much to my pleasure. I hate driving at night and in the rain, and putting those two together would end badly. I just knew it. Accompanied only by the occasional roll of thunder, I started to feel a bit anxious. I can't explain it, I just felt shaken up, probably because it was night and it could start raining. Or maybe I had been reading too many ghost stories and legends, and tonight seemed to reflect the mood of the stories I read almost obsessively. To try and calm myself, I flicked on my old car's radio and turned the old-fashioned knob back and forth, slowing down a bit as I attempted to find a station that came in clearly. Nothing doing. Weird. There was a broadcasting tower right near here. It usually came in perfectly, clear as day. But still, nothing. The white noise and static of the blank stations was doing nothing to appease my anxiety. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as more thunder boomed from the sky. Aggravated, I forcefully shut off the radio, gritting my teeth. Glancing down at the dashboard, I noticed I was nearly out of gas. Groaning, I searched the road for a sign for gas. As I was scanning the side of the road, I noticed from the corner of my eye 2 figures walking on the side of the road, shrouded in shadow. They were walking slowly. One turned around, walking backwards, his or her thumb sticking out. I felt compelled to pull over, give them a ride, and I found my hands turning the wheel slightly, but I pulled back, realizing how stupid it would be of me to accept 2 random strangers into my car in the middle of the night on a backcountry road. I sped up and past them, trying not to look at them as I did so, though I felt oddly intrigued by them. As I focused on the road ahead, it started drizzling, dropping my mood another level or 2. Along with the rain, the thunder seemed louder, closer as the storm moved in. A few seconds passed until I gave in to my compulsions to look at the 2 figures, and I glanced in my rearview mirror. It seemed as if the 2 were walking faster, and the one no longer had his thumb out, but it had to be my imagination. How would I be able to tell if they were walking faster or not? It was rainy and dark. Looking back at the road, I almost missed a sign that alerted me of a gas stop up ahead. A sigh of relief passed my lips, and I slowed down, looking for any indication of the stop, pushing the thought of the 2 figures from my head. Soon I was pulling into the gas station slowly as the rain started to pick up. The store was closed, but luckily they had a 24-hour gas pump service, and that was good for me, as if they had not, I'd have run out a few more miles down the road. I shut off my car and hesitantly shuffled out of the metal shell and glanced over my shoulder, still not being able to shake that nervous feeling that had manifested inside of me earlier that night. I stood under the light of the overhang trying to figure out how to work the pump, which seemed so overcomplicated in the dim light, and with my mind not being able to focus on this simple task. The rain picked up more, heavier and louder against the concrete of the gas stop as I finally was able to get the pump into my car, forcing my hand to stop its shaking. I had a horrible feeling that my shaking wasn't just because of the bitterly cold air. Suddenly, the overhang lights of the gas station started flickering wildly, a couple going out altogether. It seems as if the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a few seconds as I glanced around, a sinking feeling starting to blossom in my stomach. As if in slow motion, I turned around, facing back towards the long, lonely road, and saw what I expected to see there. But even as much as I knew what I'd see, I still felt the drop of my stomach, the color draining from my face, and I breathed a sharp, cold breath forcefully as it almost caught in my throat. Across the street, the two figures were standing, facing me. They started crossing the street slowly but surely, and I fumbled with the gas pump. It had only been a few moments, but it seemed as if the gas pump was taking its precious time. I was shaking hard now, as thunder boomed once more, and I looked back up. The figures were now at the entrance to the gas stop, and my breath was quick and shallow as I blindly shoved the pump back into its holder, not being able to tear my eyes away from the figures. As they drew closer, I became more frantic, even though now as they walked into the flickering light of the overhang, I saw that they were just two teenagers. They looked ragged and frigid and soaked from the rain. I straightened up a bit, still terrified, but another compulsive feeling similar to the one I experienced in the car was bubbling, and I felt obligated to talk to these two. Though I insisted to myself to just drive away, not to risk anything. They were extremely close now, at the next pump when I slid into my car, shaking wildly, and fumbled for my keys, cursing myself as I dropped them on the floor. Leaning down, I swiped them up and sat back up, a cold, sickening feeling as I came face to face with one of the teens, who had his hand on my window, knocking slowly but forcefully. I rolled down the window a bit, just a bit, no bigger than to allow maybe a small child's hand through. Before I spoke, he spoke first, the other figure standing in the background still, but I could see something of a grin there on her pale face. "Can you give us a ride into town? We missed the bus and don't have a ride." He spoke slow, and something about his voice made me shiver. A cold chill swept down my spine, and I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Clearing my throat, I glanced at the dashboard and at the keys in my hand. I'm sorry, but I'm not going into town," I stuttered, keeping my eyes down, not at the kids. However, the teenager knocked harsher and made me jump a little as he insisted another time for a ride. I told him no once more and looked up, trying to seem intimidating, which seems silly, trying to seem intimidating to a child, but a horrible, chilling sight greeted me. I looked the kid right in the eyes as I sharply gasped, my back hitting my seat as I backed away. He had eyes. Oh, he did. But they were blacker than night, pitch black. No discernible pupils and no white whatsoever showing. Pure black, deep, brooding, and surprisingly intriguing. But my fear got the better of me, and I quickly turned the key, and my engine revved to life. I thanked God, which I had never ever done before tonight. My car had not stalled and went to pull away, and the kid banged on my window with a pale fist, screaming for a ride. I took off speedily down the road, apologizing to my father again and again. I had laughed at him, never took his warning seriously. After a few more minutes, I pulled into my driveway and right into my lawn in front of my porch. I didn't want to spend any more time outside than I already had, and jumped from the car, leaving the car door open, and ran inside, slamming the door and locking it, even going as far as to put a chair in front of the door in case someone or something tried to get in. Sinking into the chair of the front of the door, I shivered uncontrollably and started to cry, hiding my face in my hands, as two dark figures stood at the end of my driveway.
Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos with one headphone in, so I can hear my infant daughter if she cries. That way, my wife can get a full night's sleep. She works at 4 a.m. at a hospital every day. I decided to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I was about to doze off, I heard a thumping coming from the front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room. Realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, I dozed back off. But then I heard the thumping again. "Damn cat," I muttered as I got out of bed to run him off of the porch. But when I looked through the kitchen window, I saw that he wasn't there. Now I was up again, confused, and not the least bit tired. I figured I would just make some tea and check Facebook while I was up. Maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window again. And there they were, the tops of two short-statured people's heads, cresting the stars just above my window frame. The people were just short enough to not see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned. Then they knocked. The knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump I had just blamed on my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept back to the baby's room. I assumed it was some of the people from the low-income housing across the road from me that were high or hiding from the cops, or maybe looking for my cousin who stays with me often and has many friends over. The last thing I needed was try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got to my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows. Both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect time. These stoners were going to wake my daughter if I didn't run them off now. Pissed off, I went out to the kitchen, unlocked and opened the window, ready to kick some little idiot ass. It happened then. Standing there looking up at me were 2 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. The smaller of the two then spoke.
"May we use your telegraph?"
I just stared blankly at these boys, horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use my telegraph. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No crickets chirping, no dogs barking, no cars driving by. Nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell, anything that would have made any sense of the situation. I calmly replied, "I don't have service at my house. Sorry." The expressions on their faces turned to rage as I finished my sentence. Swiftly, I shut the window and locked it as quickly as I could, then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from her crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the windows was back. I dropped to the floor as close to the wall as I could and held my little girl in my arms and wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard it. My wife's alarm clock. The thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked. "I just had a bad dream," is all I could mutter out. "Okay, well, give me the baby so I can feed her before work." I handed my wife the baby, and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made coffee for her. For some reason, just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing happened. I walked her out to the car nervously with the baby in my arms. I asked her not to leave until I walked back in the house. She was put off by my request, but did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the door again, and in the house I sat, horrified, until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house. And we did so. Now, here I sit, horrified, while she sleeps in the guest room with my daughter. I can't help but wonder why those boys stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of black-eyed kids. Every story I've read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry.
On March 17th, 2008, I had my one and only encounter with a black-eyed kid. I was only 12 years old. Before that day, I'd never even heard of the mysterious creatures. I was sitting in an old Chevy pickup outside of a hairdressing place, waiting for my mom to get her hair cut. After waiting around for about 15 minutes, I noticed a younger kid walking back and forth along the sidewalk in front of the parked car. At first I thought I recognized him as one of my friends from school, so I banged on the front windshield trying to get his attention. After a few hits, he looked over in my direction. I immediately realized he was no one I knew. At that point I wasn't scared at all, at least not yet. The boy walked over to the side of my car and just stared. The way he peered into the window, I think it was purposefully done to make sure I got a good look at his eyes. Like he was trying to intentionally freak me out. Let me tell you, if you've never seen a black-eyed kid, you have an idea of what to imagine, but no clue how haunting it is up close. Eyes black as the night sky. I heard the faint sound of the boy as he whispered on the other side of the glass, "You must let me in." I locked the car doors and wedged myself down as far as I could into the space below the seats. I didn't pop my head back up until 5 minutes later. He was gone. When my mother got back to the car, she told me a boy with black eyes came into the hairdresser's and spoke with her, insisting that she give him the keys to her car. She refused. Thank God she did.
It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter. She was staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months, and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best bet would be to open the door and show her nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but that's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it should work on a puppy too. I opened, and she raced to the front door. She stood there snarling at the door. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door to show her everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumped towards me, and when my hand touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerism changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I'd been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was a smidgen shorter than the other, and didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be about 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde, and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking olive-colored pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a girl who looked to be about 3 or 4, in the same style jeans and button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one was looking at the ground shyly, but had the same style of hair, tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to the one my daughter has, as was her style of dress. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have asked these children to come in and given them some tea or hot chocolate to get them out of the bitter cold, but something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled or anything. I hadn't turned on any lights. These kids had no indicators I was at the door. The older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and had no accent whatsoever. She had her head tilted downward, and I couldn't see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that's when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black, or midnight blue, or a very dark shade of purple. They were otherworldly. She then said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who has been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I have never been one to believe in these things. As a staunch atheist and skeptic, when it comes to the paranormal, I had written off many a ghost story from friends and family members who were eager to tell their tales. I didn't believe it. Still, I couldn't rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I didn't answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door. Lucy was still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step, the tone changed. At first, it seemed polite. When I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If you wanted to do that, we would have broken in. I'll ask again. May we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backward. Though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back towards the door, it wasn't a physical pulling so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I ran back into my room, covered up the window, locked the door, and sat there in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then there was silence. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about black-eyed kids that they can't come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear I'll be the exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget it. But this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when the house is silent at night, tells me otherwise.
Let me start by saying that I know how hard this is all to believe, but now that things have started to make a turn for the worse, I feel like I should share this story. I made the mistake of letting the black-eyed kids inside, and now I'm worried that I might die because of it. I hope this will be a warning to everybody who is ever in the same position as me and to not make the same mistake that I did. I live just outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everybody knows one another and people don't have to lock their doors at night. There's never been any need to. So a little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small house on a dirt road just off the rural route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the hills get very slippery in the snow, so I thought that somebody might have been in an accident and broken down. This is before it happened. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion spotlight was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from our road and into our driveway, but there wasn't any car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road and nobody had driven in, at least for a couple of hours that is. Our front door was obstructed by the window and I could see that somebody was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I decided to wake up my husband just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again and my husband went to answer it while I stood there in the hallway. What my husband found when he opened the door was disturbing. There were 2 children standing in the snow looking towards the ground. They were a boy and a girl and they could not have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely and had very odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight and the boy had a dated haircut that almost looked like it was a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for winter at all and my first thought was that they must have been Mennonite children, but as far as I know, there was never a large community of them near us. Thinking back on it now, I know that my normal reaction to seeing children in a snowstorm would have been to rush them inside and bundle them up with some warm blankets and hot chocolate, but that's not how this felt. When my husband asked them if they were alright and if they wanted to come in, they wouldn't even make eye contact with him. My husband looked at me like, what should I do? And I asked the kids where their parents were. They'll be here soon. That's all they said. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, so only reasonable thought in my head was that there must have been an accident or these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me not to let these kids inside, I did so anyway. I went into the kitchen to make them some hot chocolate while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to them. He was asking them if they were okay, where they come from and how far they'd walked, if their parents' car had broken down, just stuff like that. But they always answered, our parents will be here soon. They spoke in almost a sing-songy voice. They weren't afraid to be in a stranger's home at all, which was weird. I started to notice that our cats, we had 4 at the time, were all hiding except Pigeon, who was in the kitchen with me. Now normally, our cats are very curious and friendly, and we have to be careful that they don't run out of the door when we leave. This time, none of them even tried to see who was there, which I thought was very strange. All of the hair on the back of Pigeon's neck was now standing up. When I went down to stroke him, he hissed at me and went to bite me. I've never seen him do that before. This is really strange, I thought to myself. As I then walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch as still as could be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. I asked him what was wrong and he said that he just felt very dizzy all of a sudden, but he would be fine. I turned back to the children to give them their chocolate, but when they looked at me, I gasped. It took everything inside of me not to drop the mugs and run away. When they looked at me, their eyes were completely black. They had no whites, just giant black pupils. When they saw how scared I was of them, they stood up and asked if they could use the bathroom. I tried to be as composed as I could and show them down to the hallway. They then went into the bathroom together and I hurried back to my husband to ask him if he'd seen their eyes. He had seen them too, and said it looked like his brother's badly bruised eyes after his car accident. We were just in the middle of talking about those children when my husband's nose started to bleed. Now he's never had a nosebleed as long as I've known him. I just knew inside myself that this had to be something to do with the kids in the bathroom. I then started crying while I ran to get my husband some tissues. That's when the power went out. I heard my husband's name being yelled from the living room, and I then started to walk right back through the hallway. I was then stopped dead in my tracks. The two children were standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't even moving. I've never been so scared in my life. They were just stood there in the darkness. After what felt like forever, the boy said, "Our parents are here." And they then walked to the door, opened it, and walked out, leaving it wide open. My husband then quickly jumped up to close it behind them and almost fell over in the process. We then quickly looked out the windows to see what was going on. We then saw that there were two men standing by a black car idling at the end of our driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black coloured suits and were very tall, at least 6 feet tall each. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into the car, and drove off. Our power then come on about half an hour later, but nothing was the same after that. Over the next few months, 3 of our cats went missing. We can only assume that they all went away but never come back. The worst thing though was coming home to find Pigeon in a puddle of blood on the living room floor. He looked like he had been vomiting blood. The vet told us that he had some kind of hemorrhage. After my husband's nosebleeds become a regular occurrence, we went to see the family doctor. He really didn't know what to make of it, other than maybe just a dry nasal passage. But unfortunately, my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive skin cancer. When the doctor asked us if he had been using tanning beds, we thought he was having us on, but apparently, this kind of cancer is very common for people overusing indoor tanning machines. The doctors think that he might recover, but they're unsure how he got ill so quickly. My husband has never worked an outdoor job and spends most of the time indoors. So since we let the black-eyed kids inside our home, I've suffered from regular dizzy spells and nosebleeds on a regular basis. I've had other issues which I won't mention here, but trust me when I say that I'm suddenly in the worst condition of my whole life and nobody can help me. I know all of this is because I let the black-eyed children into my house. We've told everybody we could about the strange kids that showed up that night, but nobody else saw them and simply laughs at us when we mention the Mennonite kids, but we know what we saw. I wish my husband had never opened that door.
So, this really freaked me out. Yesterday, I noticed my neighbor hadn't put out all his Halloween decorations and lights. The past 2 years I lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well. He's younger, single, but I know he likes kids, not in a creepy way. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway, and I saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up, or that house up the street is going to beat you for best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy out. I asked if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now, I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming around our neighborhood, which is a pretty safe neighborhood with tons of young families living here. So I asked him what had happened. He said last year he had his brother's family over so they could trick-or-treat in the neighborhood, since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door, like always. His family took off around 10:30, and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters, but by 11:30, they were pretty much done. So he was inside, watching TV, and the doorbell rings. He grabs a candy bowl and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight, and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters to still be out. But then, notices he hasn't turned off all his decoration lights yet. so his house is still a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell, "Boo!" or something to freak them out, but stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13 to 14, and the other around 16 to 17. Both boys. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness. Like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him, and he noticed they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there, holding the candy bowl, like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character and ask for candy or something. The younger one said they had gotten lost and needed to come in and use his phone. That was when he closed the door more than halfway on them and said, "No, sorry." And the older one said something like, "Can we just wait in your house until our parents come get us?" But by then, he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something, or intending to rob him, and he just keeps mumbling, "No, sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so fucking scared at that point that they were going to try to break in through one of his windows or something. But he looked through the peephole, and they had turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all, and he said he stayed up till like 5 a.m. because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my god, this sounds so familiar. Just like the Black-Eyed Kids urban legend. And then I thought, hey, maybe this dude is trying to scare me, because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him incredulously, but trying not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, that is really crazy. Sounds like the Black-Eyed Kids. And he just looks at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? And I said no, but told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later, I get a knock on my door, and admittedly, almost jump out of my skin thinking it's a demon child. It was my neighbor, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of the Black-Eyed Kids before, and it's so similar to what happened to him. So we talked a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about that urban legend, and it's possible it was just teenagers with black sclera contacts trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius, by the way. But he said the fear he felt was so primal and came over him the second he opened the door for them.
Let me preface this by saying that I am by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in the paranormal, ghosts, demons, aliens, whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween I have to admit has me scratching my head. So it had been a slow trick-or-treating night in our neighborhood, which was pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas dropped off in ours to have a consistent parade at our door. That night I'd say we had no more than 8 or 10 groups of kids come by the entire evening. It was about 9:30 p.m. and my husband and I were sitting in our family room watching some of those ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that stuff, but I do like a good ghost story every now and then, and it was Halloween after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over a half an hour, and it was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light off and let our dog Chloe out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and is very docile. We only put her in her crate because we were afraid that she would try to get out and play with all the kids, and I don't want to have to chase after her down the street. Also, we didn't want her to scare any of the kids off because she would look a little intimidating to the younger kids. So I turned the outside light off and let Chloe out, and she followed me back to the couch to lay down by my feet. It was about 10 p.m. when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night and was going to go upstairs, take a shower, and get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday, and he still had to get up early the next day. My teenage son was out with his friends at the local haunted house, and wouldn't be expected back for an hour or so, so that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean that those shows don't freak me out a bit. And being alone now watching, I'd have to say that I was kind of on edge, as it were. It wasn't long before I heard the upstairs water for the shower turn on when there came a light at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell? Really? It's almost 10 o'clock, go home. But soon, an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows in the dark, and without the porch light, it would be extra obvious to anyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door has a big beveled glass pane, and anyone right at the door could see in enough to tell someone was in the family room watching TV. It would be pretty rude for me to just sit there and not answer it. Again from the door. I glanced down at Zoe, but she was gone. My gaze followed her path to the front door, expecting her to be there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up and looked around the room and found her, crouched by the back door like she was wanting out. However, she never asks to go out like that. She always comes and licks my hand and puts her head on my knee. This was totally out of character for her, and I have to say, heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, crate," I said, and she turned back and looked at me like, "Hell no, lady, I ain't moving." I yelled up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew that there was no chance that he'd be hearing me. About that time, a car drove down the street and cast just enough light on the door where I could see the silhouettes of 2 small children through the glass. I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably a couple of my neighbors on their way back home and wanted to stop by and show me their costumes or something. I headed to the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't going to follow. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself as she just sat there. I turned on the porch light and went to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass that there were a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and I began to wonder about what kind of parents would let their kids run the streets that late at night. I opened the door enough to where I could block Chloe's escape if she decided to grow some balls, which was about 2 feet. What struck me immediately as odd was the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were in normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick-or-treat either. I began to feel uneasy again. It was a boy and girl. The girl to my left was older, I'd say about 11 or 12. I could tell that she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features as our lights were from high above and on columns on the front porch, so that the light was coming from behind them. I hadn't opened the door wide enough to let any light from inside hit them directly. The boy was younger and about a foot shorter, I'd say 8 or 9, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can we come inside and use your phone to call our mom?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own? I don't remember the last time I had anyone ask to use my home phone. Hun, don't you have a phone of your own to call your mom?" I asked. This was when things got really weird. Both the kids turned to look at each other like they were going to say something to one another, but neither ever spoke. They both turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone's battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here, and my brother's scared." I have to admit, there were 2 competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart that wanted to help these 2 small children get to their mom. The other, a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was when I noticed that during the short conversation I had already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and they again looked at each other. After a short moment, they turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside while you call our mom?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer to the door like she was just going to walk by me. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes. That's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror I don't think I've ever felt in my life. I could feel every hair on my arms and back of my neck standing at attention. I closed the door to where just my face was able to stick out. The little girl stopped and again pleaded. "Please, ma'am, we're really scared and alone out here. We have to come inside. Please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when that fear took over and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mom if you give me the number," I shouted through the door, "but I'm not letting you in my house." I could see them standing there on the porch, just staring at me through the beveled glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but a bigger part didn't want to lose track of where they were. It would have freaked me out even more not to know where they were. After what seemed like forever, but probably only a few seconds, I decided I'd call my neighbor who lived across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to my phone, I glanced back at the door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room underneath the bed. When I got to my phone, I started to look for his contact info. It was only then that the kids stepped away from the door and began to walk to the street. As they did, I walked to the front door to get a better look to see where they went, still not calling my neighbor. If you got close enough to the glass, you could see through and make out people's shapes, but you couldn't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door could make you pretty obvious to anyone outside looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were standing under the streetlight nearest my house, staring at me. As I lifted the phone to my ear after calling, only then did I realize the kids started walking down the street. I met my neighbor under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in this stuff and never even heard of the black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think? What I have to think? These kids were just out there yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them. They were good. Really good. They scared the shit out of me and my dog.